Some houses don't creak from age. They whisper secrets. And at Hawthorne Grange the silence didn't mean peace, it meant someone somewhere was finally done hiding the truth. But tell me, if your family's darkest secret was the only thing keeping your world from falling apart, would you dare to let it surface? Magnolia House stood like a quiet relic at the edge of the village. A place where time did not pass but rather paused, as though the air itself held its breath. The creeping ivy curled like secrets around its weathered stone, and the windows, dulled with the patina of decades, reflected more memory than light. There was an old, almost reverent hush to the estate, broken only by the gentle sigh of wind through the overgrown hedges. Miss Eliza Marlowe arrived just as spring's hesitant light spilled across the gravel path, a reluctant warmth teasing the first fragile blooms of the magnolia tree that arched near the front gate. Invited by her distant acquaintance, the gracious but visibly worn Mrs. Beatrice Hollowell, Eliza stepped into a world that felt at once serene and stifling, as if the house itself held something back. Though the gardens had faded from their former grandeur, their bones remained neatly aligned hedgerows leading nowhere, a moss-laced sundial whispering forgotten hours, and stone benches that remembered laughter long since swallowed by silence. Beatrice welcomed her with trembling hands and a pot of strong bergamot tea, and as they settled in the drawing-room, their conversation meandered: arthritis, weathered friendships, the village grocer's decline, before finally pausing on the name of Lucinda Vale, the reclusive aunt who, Beatrice admitted with a quiet falter, hadn't left her room in weeks. She barely speaks, Beatrice confessed, glancing toward the staircase as though Lucinda's silence pressed against the very walls, but insists on her breakfast tray, always at the same hour, always untouched. Eliza said nothing, but her eyes, keen with years of quiet observation, lifted instinctively to the second-floor window, where gauzy curtains trembled in a breeze no one else seemed to notice. There was something heavy in the air, not quite grief, not quite fear, but a watchful, lingering tension, an echo of words never spoken, and eyes that had once seen too much. She stirred her tea slowly, noting the way the leaves clung to the bottom of her cup like omens. Magnolia House, she thought, was not merely a place where memories lived, it was a place where they refused to die. On the second morning, under a sky that couldn't decide between rain or sun, the news came, not as a declaration, but as a murmur passed down the corridor. Lucinda Vale had died in the early hours, her frail body found perfectly composed, hands folded, lips curled into what might have been relief, or resignation. The village took the news with that curious blend of propriety and speculation. After all, Lucinda had long since withdrawn from society, and with her departure came not grief, but a stirring unease, as though her absence left behind something more unsettling than her presence ever had. The funeral was discreet, the mourners few, the condolences polite and shallow. But on the third evening, as the last echo of footsteps faded from the stone walkway, a letter appeared. There was no knock, no bell, it simply waited on the foyer table, as though it had always been there. Beatrice found it at twilight. An envelope, the color of bone, unsealed, its edges crisp, bearing no stamp, no hand of origin. Inside was a single page, its folds meticulous, and nestled within it, pressed flat and haunting, a magnolia blossom, its petals browned at the edges like old truths. The note, penned in looping ink that bled slightly at the curves, read, "Before the roots rot, the truth must breathe." No name, no hint of who had written it, only that stark sentence and the scent of something sweet, wilted, and deeply final. Beatrice insisted it was a cruel prank, the work of idle minds or morbid fancy. But Eliza, who had seen the ways in which guilt writes itself into the quiet corners of old houses, noted the freshness of the paper, the way the ink had not cracked with age, the deliberate lack of haste in its placement. It had not traveled, it had waited. In the days that followed, Magnolia House changed in subtle, unspoken ways. Doors began creaking open on their own, as if the house were exhaling after years of restraint. The staff whispered more softly, and Eliza often caught Beatrice standing still in the hallway, listening, not for sounds, but for the silence itself. Something had shifted, something deeper than grief, and beneath it all lay the feeling that Lucinda Vale's story had not ended with her death, but had only now begun to speak. The rain fell in a slow, persistent hush over Ashmere Hall, as if the sky itself conspired to smother every sound within its ancient stone walls, the kind of rain that blurred the landscape into shadows, and gave the illusion that the world beyond the estate no longer existed. Miss Agatha Craythorne arrived under the unassuming pretext of a friendly visit, but even before she stepped fully into the marbled vestibule, she sensed the air brimming with a quiet unease, like a stage where the performance had ended, but the actors still wore their masks. Ashmere, though grand in architecture and noble in lineage, now seemed burdened with an invisible weight, as if its very foundation was groaning beneath the strain of secrets long buried, and now threatening to surface. The recent passing of Matilda Ellingham, the matriarch whose grip over the family extended far beyond her failing health, had not broken the house, it had disturbed it, like a stone dropped into a deep stagnant pool. Her death had not been unexpected, but it had not been uneventful either. Whispers had already begun to slither through the corridors, before the doctor had even signed the certificate. Imogen Vale, the youngest of the Ellingham descendants, had startled so violently upon hearing the name of Matilda's estranged sister Rowena, that she shattered a teacup against the dining-room hearth, her face pale, not with grief, but with something nearer to dread. The staff, too, moved about with unnatural care, their footsteps muffled, their eyes lowered as if fearful that the house might take offense at their gaze. It was Helena Merrick, Matilda's closest companion and the executor of her affairs, who drew Miss Craythorne's most precise attention. A woman of exquisite restraint, and perfectly tailored manners, Helena had always seemed made of glass, beautiful, composed, but perhaps too easily cracked under pressure, and now her poise appeared held together not by calm, but by calculation. Her voice, always firm, carried the slightest tremble when discussing Matilda's final weeks. Her fingers, though gloved, curled tightly into her lap, when the topic of the East Wing arose, and her gaze never lingered too long on the locked conservatory door, though it clearly wanted to. On her second evening, Miss Craythorne found herself alone beneath the weather-worn sundial in the rose garden, where a single Latin word memor was etched beneath its shadowed face, to remember. In her hand she turned over a dried rose petal, brittle and bruised, found not in the garden but carefully tucked inside the pages of Matilda's devotional book which had not left the study since the funeral, an odd detail, considering there hadn't been fresh flowers in that room in weeks. Something in the gesture felt intentional, as if a message had been left behind encoded in petals and dust. Within the halls the tension stretched taut like piano wire, every knock on a door, every whisper behind cupped hands seemed to strike a note that only the house could hear. The will was scheduled to be read that Sunday after service, but already Ashmere had begun to breathe differently, as if bracing itself. Peregrine Blythe, the solicitor known for his exactitude and lack of humor, arrived precisely at noon, his coat still damp from the storm, his leather briefcase clutched like a confession. The drawing room, arranged to resemble decorum, was more akin to a tableau of unease. Helena took her seat nearest the fire, her posture impeccable, but her fingers betraying her with a subtle twitch. Imogen hovered by the window, her reflection ghost-like against the rain-slicked glass, her arms crossed as if to hold herself together. The staff stood just beyond the doorway, pretending disinterest, though none moved, and Miss Craythorne, seated with quiet grace near the mantel, her gaze sharp beneath her veil, knew that what would be revealed today was not just the contents of Matilda's estate, but the shape of the truth itself, distorted, hidden and waiting to uncoil. Because somewhere in that house, behind the well-kept curtains and polished wood, a truth had been smothered for decades, one that was beginning now to exhale. Outwardly poised yet inwardly sharp as a blade unsheathed, Mr. Thorne, the family solicitor, entered Windermere House with the same unnerving composure that Miss Ellison remembered from years past, tall, skeletal in posture, his expression unreadable, and his briefcase gripped not with the tension of anticipation, but with the solemnity of a man carrying either a legal document or a buried truth. No flicker of emotion betrayed his features, not even when he offered his flat condolences, which were met with murmurs that fell like brittle leaves in the silence of the drawing-room. The conversation, when attempted, limped along uncertainly, fraying at the edges like a frayed velvet curtain, thin, forced and ready to unravel. Even Mrs. Weatherby, whose charm had once stitched together the most awkward silences with a well-timed anecdote or fluttering laugh, seemed at a loss for words, her sentences collapsing into pauses heavy with unspoken questions. Above the hearth, the oil portrait of Lady Honoria Blackwell loomed, her austere gaze cast not toward the firelight or the sweeping terrace doors, but fixated instead on the narrow garden path that led to the ruined stone arbor, half hidden behind ivy and shadow, an unsettling detail that did not escape Miss Ellison's notice. She had always believed that old houses did not whisper with the secrets of their past, they listened, waiting. And on this day, Windermere House seemed to strain with the weight of memory, holding its breath. The hours leading to the will's reading were stained with silences that hung in the air like thick smoke, some hesitant, some crackling with tension, and some that felt intentionally planted like traps in conversation. As Miss Ellison moved quietly between rooms, watching more than she spoke, she began piecing together the puzzle, not through what was said, but through what was withheld. Henry Llewellyn, ever the picture of easy-going charm, had snapped too sharply at young Ivy when she asked whether she might return to the city. His tone, clipped and tightly wound, carried the chill of command rather than care. The housekeeper, Nora Dayton, circled Miss Ellison like a wary cat, her eyes flickering with something dark and defensive. It was not discretion that held Nora's tongue, Miss Ellison thought, but the bitter memory of having once spoken out and suffered for it. And Mr. Thorne, master of procedure though he was, faltered slightly, barely a breath, barely a blink, when reminded of Lady Honoria's long-ago musings about changing her will. He waved the comment away with such unnatural haste, that even the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to pause in suspicion. But it was the scullery maid, timid Rosaline, who offered the strangest revelation in a breathless whisper over the linen cupboard door. "I heard laughter, miss, from her room, but she'd passed the night before." Miss Ellison said nothing, but the phrase burned into her mind like frostbite. It was later, over tea in the vicarage garden with Mrs. Hargreaves, the Reverend's wife and Windermere's unofficial archivist, that more threads began to loosen. Between sips of chamomile, and polite mentions of parish events, Mrs. Hargreaves leaned in, her tone dropping like a curtain. "Before the war, Lady Honoria was engaged, you know, to Colonel Frederick Carraway. Charming man, tragic end, found dead by the old chapel, just beyond the arbor, terrible bruise at the base of the skull, called it an accident, of course, but even then," her voice trailed off, not in hesitation, but in suggestion. "There was talk of another woman, a servant girl, very young. Edith, I believe." Miss Ellison's teacup stilled mid-air. Edith was Nora Dayton's maiden name. "Strange how people rise again in these old places," Mrs. Hargreaves added, almost cheerfully. "Like ghosts with keys." That evening, a wet mist clung to the hedgerows, as if the house itself was sweating out secrets. Miss Ellison stood at the garden's edge, gazing toward the stone arbor, the cracked angel above it now nothing more than a weathered silhouette. And she understood then, with the clarity born of long observation, that Windermere House was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by memory, memory that had found no grave, no absolution, and no silence deep enough to bury it. And somewhere in the shadows, it waited to be spoken again. The atmosphere that clung to Magnolia Court was thick with a heaviness not born of the weather, but of a far older burden, an unspoken sorrow, a lingering dread that seemed to seep from the very walls and settle in the hearts of those within. It was a silence that felt oppressive, as though the house itself held its breath, weighed down by memories too painful to voice. Even Mr. Fenley, whose usual boisterous laughter had become increasingly hollow and forced over the evening, had withdrawn early, citing fatigue, though his eyes revealed a deep unsettled unrest. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly in the small sitting room, her needlework untouched in her lap, her keen ears tuned not to the usual chatter, but to the eerie absence of it, a silence that spoke louder than any words. When Elsie, the youngest and usually sprightliest of the maids, entered much later than custom dictated, carrying a tea tray, her pallor and trembling hands betrayed a distress that the kindest nod from Miss Marple gently coaxed into confession. With a voice barely more than a whisper, and eyes darting nervously toward the stairwell, Elsie revealed she had heard genuine crying, not the loud unrestrained sobs one might expect, but a quiet, restrained weeping that seemed desperate to remain unheard, coming from Miss Drake's room. It was the morning after Miss Drake had passed, Elsie explained, and although she had seen the room peaceful and still in the morning, the sobbing had returned later, haunting the empty space, as though something unresolved lingered. Miss Marple's mind sharpened instantly. A house might echo, with grief, regret, or guilt for many reasons, but the sound of weeping from a room meant to be silent, its occupant no longer among the living, suggested something darker, a cry not born of innocence or mere sorrow, but from a restless spirit of a very different kind, tangled in secrets and unspoken truths. As the appointed hour for the reading of the will approached, the atmosphere in the drawing-room thickened with anticipation and old formalities, muffled beneath the weight of worn carpets and the decorum of a bygone era. The full cast of Magnolia Court's recent tragedies gathered there, each seated with the rigid precision of actors frozen in a tableau. Crow stood by the sideboard, tall, impeccable, and yet visibly bracing himself against the gravity of what was to come, his hand resting uneasily on the slim leather folio that held the final testament of the late Eleanor Drake. Caroline Drake sat closest to the hearth, her expression carefully composed but taut beneath the surface, one finger tapping a subtle restless rhythm on her folded hands, betraying a storm of restrained emotions. Lucy Fenley, positioned near the window, seemed withdrawn, eyes flickering but avoiding connection, as though reluctant to face the inevitable truths about to unfold. Mr. Fenley, having shed his earlier facade of good-natured host, observed the proceedings with a cool detachment that hinted at inner turmoil, as if watching a grim drama with weary resignation. Behind them the household staff, Mrs. Hartley, Edith Clamwell and Elsie, stood quietly at the back, their faces respectful and muted, but their eyes sharp and alert, sensing the fragile tension that rippled beneath polite appearances. Miss Marple, seated apart in her high-backed chair, remained silent, her gaze piercing and unwavering, having witnessed enough such moments to know that the real revelations were often not in the reading of the will itself, but in the charged silence that followed. When Mr. Crow finally cleared his throat and began the formal recital, the routine acknowledgments, the modest bequests to servants, and the charitable donations, the room held its breath, the tension building like a gathering storm. Magnolia Court itself was left in full to Caroline Drake, a decision expected and met with only polite murmurs of assent. But then came the clause that shattered the veneer of calm. A significant portion of Eleanor Drake's personal fortune, including a collection of exquisite jewelry and a substantial trust fund, was bequeathed to Lucy Fenley. The moment stretched thin, suspended between disbelief and unspoken questions. Mr. Fenley's eyes widened in shock, his composure cracking for the barest instant. Caroline's austere mask faltered, her fingers ceasing their tapping as a shadow crossed her face. Edith Clamwell's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between the witnesses. Miss Marple observed it all, sensing the fragile equilibrium of the room tilting dangerously, as old resentments and hidden motives threatened to erupt. The silence that followed the reading was thick and suffocating, louder than any word could have been, charged with the unvoiced fears and suspicions of those present, signaling that beneath the polished surface of Magnolia Court's genteel tragedy lay secrets still waiting to be unearthed. Fractionally before her fingers could curl into a full fist, Caroline's hand paused mid-air, its discreet tapping silent as if caught by an invisible grip, and in that single stillness, Lucy, whose pallor already mirrored porcelain left too long in the dark, appeared to pale even further, as though the air itself had whispered something incomprehensible to her alone. A language not unknown, but deeply unwelcomed. Mr. Crow read on, unwavering in tone, but not in soul, for though his eyes never faltered on the page, Miss Marple, watching from her quiet, near invisible perch, noticed the subtle furrow in his brow deepen, a sign not of confusion but of silent recalibration, the kind of tension born when expectation quietly collapses into shock. He too, it seemed, had anticipated a different allocation, a more socially palatable outcome. When the final line of Eleanor's will was uttered, a hush descended, not like quiet, but like a cold fog wrapping around warm windows. The room didn't breathe for a beat too long, and then, civility snapped back into place like a snapped fan in a lady's hand, automatic, practiced but deeply unnatural. Mr. Fenley rose, his tone an octave too bright, calling Eleanor's decision unexpected yet admirable, though Miss Marple caught the micro-hesitation between his words, a flicker of something far less generous hiding behind the mask. Caroline rose just after, as though the cue had been choreographed, offering tea with a smile too wide and gestures too smooth, her every move screaming refinement while her eyes, sharp darting, betrayed unease. Lucy murmured thanks to Mr. Crow, but it was the kind of gratitude whispered not from joy, but from obligation, her voice barely alive, her form folded inward, as though she wished to vanish into the upholstery. She hadn't smiled, she hadn't made eye contact, and her hands, still nestled in her lap, were tightly entwined, knuckles white, fingers turning over each other like tangled threads of a knot she couldn't undo. When addressed directly by her father, Lucy spoke in a voice so low and flat, that it seemed borrowed from someone else, someone older, someone tired. Fenley, normally verbose, now measured each syllable, as if testing for poison. He congratulated her with warmth, yes, but the warmth was too precise, too focused, like a spotlight hiding a shadow. Caroline's charm, though ever present, now shimmered with brittleness, like the sheen on glass just before it cracks, and her compliments to Mr. Crow rang hollow, over-polished. Miss Marple watched all this without moving, her expression polite, even bland, but her mind raced. Every time Lucy's name was mentioned, Caroline's jaw clenched imperceptibly, the movement so slight one might mistake it for chewing, but Miss Marple knew better. Lucy, meanwhile, looked not triumphant but haunted, as though the weight of the inheritance were not gold but grief, and it pressed heavily on her shoulders. Even Mr. Crow, the ever-efficient solicitor, had begun to fumble, not overtly, but in his guarded posture, in the way he now avoided Lucy's gaze, and spoke to Caroline with a touch too much reverence, as though trying to realign loyalties before they fractured. Something was deeply wrong, not with the document itself, but with the vacuum it left behind. Magnolia Court had shifted, its equilibrium disrupted, and Miss Marple, who understood that truth has gravity, knew that wherever balance is broken, something begins to fall. As tea was poured and small talk attempted like soldiers marching out of rhythm, Miss Marple leaned in gently, inquiring if Mr. Crow had received any letters from Eleanor before her death. He blinked, stalling half a second too long, and then shook his head, waving the thought aside with airy indifference. Only standard instructions, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. She was eccentric in her later years. But when Miss Marple softly mentioned the letter, that letter, his demeanor shifted just slightly, his eyes hardening, his reply swift and dismissive. Sentimental nonsense, I imagine. She did like gestures. Yet Miss Marple, unfazed and unfooled, had already retrieved the envelope from her bag, and rested it lightly on her lap. Her eyes weren't drawn to the handwriting, nor to the brittle flower pressed within, but to something far more revealing. 4 minuscule indentations at the upper corner of the page, almost invisible, yet unmistakable, the ghostly impression of a pin or clasp, long since removed. Later, in the quiet of her room, she examined the paper beneath her magnifying glass, and confirmed her suspicion. There had once been something else within, something absent now, not another page, no, but something dimensional, a clipping perhaps, a photograph, proof, something Eleanor had included deliberately, and someone else had removed just as deliberately. It hadn't been forgotten, it had been intercepted, a truth cut from the paper before it could bleed. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, as if sealing a secret inside it once more, and tucked it back into her case. Outside, the garden was still waiting to bloom. But already something deeper was beginning to stir, roots twisting in silence beneath the surface. The next sign would come soon. And it did. It was the gardener's boy who found him. But what he discovered would by midday become a whisper, by afternoon, a ripple, and by nightfall, it would evolve into something else entirely, something shaped by fear, silence, and the dangerous hunger of those who had far more to lose than anyone dared admit. The body of Edmund Harrowby was discovered just as the fog began to thin into pale wisps along the hedgerows, lying motionless beside the rusted gates of the abandoned bell tower, a place so seldom visited that even the ivy grew unchecked, curling through iron scrollwork like forgotten thoughts. He looked not so much dead as interrupted, his limbs arranged in a posture too deliberate to be accidental, his face frozen in a strange expression, somewhere between surprise and realization. His clothes were strikingly formal for so early an hour, a deep navy coat with silver-stitched lapels, a silk waistcoat barely creased, his polished boots showing no trace of hurried movement. There was a faint scrape along his temple, yes, but it was the unnatural angle of his neck, and the faint shadow of bruising beneath his jaw, that lent the scene a darker implication. A sprig of dried lavender was tucked neatly into his pocket, pressed but whole, though the nearest lavender bush was 3 fields distant and weeks past bloom. The constable, summoned before breakfast and clearly irritated at the hour, mumbled something about a fainting spell or heart strain, his voice faltering when he noted the torn chain of the man's pocket watch and the bloodless indentation where a ring had once graced his finger. Lady Rowena, his half-sister and heir to the estate, accepted the news with a calm too brittle to be natural, instructing the butler to ensure the drawing-room remained locked until the afternoon sun dried the stone, and asking after the tea service as if this were merely a logistical disruption. Marjorie, the maid who had been seen the night prior weeping silently near the orchard wall, was nowhere to be found until midday, and even then could not meet anyone's eyes. Dunley, the solicitor whose arrival the evening before had surprised even the housekeeper, had not slept in his guest room, but in the library, where a single lamp had burned till morning, and an untouched glass of port still sat. Miss Everleigh, the guest who claimed to be working on a book about rare English flora, remained perched on the landing, her sketchpad closed on her lap, gaze distant, hands trembling just enough to betray whatever resolve she clung to. But it was Miss Halbrook, the retired schoolmistress known for her razor-sharp intuition, and her habit of observing more than she spoke, who arrived at the tower long after the household had retreated indoors, and the official inquiries had been filed away with a casualness that reeked of convenience. She stood still among the tangled nettles, noting the scuffed stone beneath the gate, the indentation in the moss where a second pair of shoes had stood, and the faint smell of smoke tobacco, foreign, spiced, not Edmund's usual blend. She bent to pick up what others had missed, a crumpled page torn from a ledger, its edges damp and its message incomplete, but legible enough to read the ink-blurred words. Proof enclosed, do not delay. She also saw the single silver cufflink, mismatched now, embedded in the earth, and the broken clasp of a red leather case half buried beneath a flattened clump of bluebells. By the time she returned to the manor, the village already buzzed with wild invention. He had died of fright, been poisoned by a rival, struck down by fate, cursed by some old family debt. But Miss Halbrook listened with the patience of someone who understood the architecture of lies. Each theory was dressed in superstition and rumor, but none addressed the absence of Edmund's journal, which he never parted with, nor the fact that the tower had not been entered for years, and yet its padlock lay snapped clean in two. Over tea with Lady Rowena, Miss Halbrook asked, as if in passing, whether Edmund had appeared unsettled after supper, and whether he'd received any post bearing foreign stamps. Questions met with a tight smile and a dismissive wave, but Miss Halbrook noted the scratch on the lady's wrist, hastily concealed by lace, and the pearl button missing from her sleeve. Edmund, she now understood, had not gone to the tower to die. He had gone to meet someone who had promised answers, perhaps even redemption, but someone else had arrived first or followed, and ensured that the meeting would never take place. And though the constable had left satisfied, the truth, quiet and half-buried, still clung to the morning air like perfume. Edmund had not merely fallen, He had been silenced, and in a manner that suggested not impulse but calculation. Somewhere in the hush of rooms and the rustle of hushed skirts, the answer breathed just beneath the surface, and Miss Halbrook, careful as ever, was already unspooling the threads. As the pale afternoon sunlight filtered through the thinning branches of ash and elder, the old manor house seemed suspended in breathless stillness, as though nature itself were holding its voice for what it knew had not yet fully emerged. There was something unsettling in the air, not loud, not obvious, but coiled tightly beneath the surface like a snake asleep in dry leaves, something unspoken that had begun to stir again after years of deliberate forgetting. In the dim library, with its towering bookcases and dust-muffled corners, a small detail seemed to betray the hush. An antique fountain pen lay dropped beside the hearth, its tip stained with ink that had not yet dried, and near it a faint smudge, as if a trembling finger had brushed the edge in haste. Inspector Alden, newly transferred and still wearing the starch of fresh appointment, arrived with the expression of a man hoping this would be a quick matter, a slip on the stairs, nothing more. He questioned the staff with polite indifference, nodding gravely, yet his eyes skimmed past the cracks where truth waited. Lady Tholia, regal even in grief, claimed she had heard nothing in the night, though her voice faltered ever so slightly when asked if she had been alone. Her hands, normally steady as glass, trembled just enough to betray memory's unease. The maid, Elsie, young and sharp-eyed, hesitated when recalling the flicker of light she'd seen around midnight in the drawing-room. Who late? Who quiet? She had dismissed it then. Not now, but it was Miss Eleanora who truly listened, not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. While others whispered and looked away, she wandered back to the old sundial in the east orchard, its stone base cracked with age, the Latin engraving barely visible beneath creeping moss. Veritas in umbra, truth lies in shadow. A curious choice for a garden marker, and not one made lightly, she knew. Her fingers brushed the edge, and the metal gnomon cast a blade-thin shadow, pointing not to time, but to something long buried. Behind the sundial, hidden in the roots of a twisted yew tree, her eye caught a glint, a shard of silver caked in old dirt and dried blood. She did not cry out, she simply folded it into her handkerchief, eyes narrowing. Something had happened here, not recently, but long enough ago that guilt had dried and hardened into silence, and yet the silence cracked with every careless remark. Over tea Edith Clamwell had muttered absently about Lady Tholia's garnet brooch, how it hadn't been worn in weeks, put away for safe-keeping surely. When asked casually where such heirlooms were typically stored, Edith responded without thought, in the oak bureau top drawer under the letters. But Miss Eleanora had already checked, or rather Caroline had, and when questioned, Caroline vaguely waved it off, claiming nothing valuable had been found, perhaps it had been lost or gifted. That was unlikely. A discreet word sent through a former housemaid, now married to the pawnbroker's nephew, revealed that a man matching Mr. Fenley's description had attempted to appraise both a garnet cluster and a pearl pin just 2 weeks prior. The sale had fallen through, the man had left disappointed, so Oswald had the jewels. He had taken them likely without permission, and tried to exchange them perhaps for money, or perhaps for leverage. But what leverage, Miss Eleanora wondered, and against whom? The theft alone wasn't the secret. No, it was only the thread, one tugged loose from a tapestry that had for years concealed something darker beneath its orderly weave. The brooch was only part of it. There had been a letter too, unsigned, written in a delicate but hurried hand, found beneath a stack of church newsletters. If I speak it will ruin her. But silence is not safety. And the more Eleanora dug, the more the house itself began to speak, not in words but in its absences. Photographs, in frames where faces had been carefully removed, documents filed with pages missing, a calendar with the entire month of July 1943 torn out. There had been a guest that summer, uninvited and quickly forgotten. There had been whispers of an affair, a child, a threat. The war had given everyone excuses for secrets, and the village, weary of grief, had buried more than just bodies. But truth does not die in the dark. It waits breathing beneath the floorboards, behind the locked drawers, inside the ticking heart of the sundial, until the light finally falls at the right angle, and someone like Miss Eleanora is willing to see what it reveals. Beneath the weather-worn stone and time-worn hedgerows of a village that had long since learned to swallow its stories, Miss Marple walked softly, drawn not by curiosity alone but by the unmistakable scent of a secret buried too deep to stay asleep. It was not gold or inheritance she sensed behind the quiet unraveling of the past, but something far more potent: fear, shame, guilt, woven into a silence so deliberate it had become part of the landscape. The village archives, long sealed in the disused wing of the parish office, where cobwebs hung like funeral veils and dust coated every forgotten corner, held the faint heartbeat of a mystery long stilled. The elderly volunteer archivist, startled by Miss Marple's presence and half embarrassed by the layers of neglect, was easily disarmed by her genteel manner and soft insistence that her interest was purely historical. But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her knitting spectacles, missed nothing. With fingers that handled secrets as gently as lace, she unearthed a brittle announcement tucked beneath a wartime rationing notice: the engagement of Miss Helena Darrow, daughter of the once influential Darrow family of Thornhaven Hall, to Lieutenant James Calder, a dashing officer in the Royal Naval Air Service, dated August 1941. But the paper trail went cold far too quickly. There was no wedding announcement, no photograph in the parish magazine, no mention of bells or blossoms. Instead, 2 months later, a cold line in the church records: Lieutenant James Calder, presumed lost at sea, body unrecovered. The phrasing alone pricked at Miss Marple's instinct. If the body was never recovered, how could he be presumed lost with such finality? And if he were, why no service, no commemoration, no public grief from a family known for theatrics and pride? Even more unsettling was Helena's reaction, or lack thereof. In all the years since, she had never once spoken his name in public, had forbidden even his portrait from remaining at Thornhaven. That silence, Miss Marple mused, was not mourning. It was suppression, and suppression, especially in a village like this, always means something. Over teacups and gentle conversation, Miss Marple began her delicate probing, never confronting, only listening, watching how people blinked, paused, or reached for the sugar spoon when certain names were mentioned. It was the vicar's wife, careful as a woman threading a needle in poor light, who first hinted at the truth. She spoke of old rumors, soft and dangerous, that Calder had been too friendly with Eliza Moorcroft, a young scullery maid barely 17, who had worked at Thornhaven during the height of the war. It was a lonely time, she murmured, folding her napkin with nervous hands. Men went off to die. Women clung to anything that felt alive. Mistakes were made, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss anything as mere wartime error. Eliza had disappeared shortly after Calder's death, abruptly, without a word. The house staff said she left in tears. Yet strangely, years later she returned, not as a maid, but as the housekeeper, elevated without explanation, fiercely loyal to Helena, and rarely seen outside the gates. Whispers also hinted at a terrible quarrel. The night Calder vanished, raised voices in the music room, a wine decanter shattered, footsteps storming across the marble floor. The police were never called. The death was recorded without inquiry. And Helena, once the village's golden girl, became withdrawn, her laughter extinguished, her evenings spent alone wandering the orchard paths. The pain hadn't softened with time, it had hardened into ritual. When Miss Marple finally sat down with Eliza Moorcroft, it was not with questions, but with presence. Eliza, now grey-haired and brittle, folded linens in silence, as though each crease carried the weight of memory. They were engaged, yes, she said eventually, her voice no longer her own, but something borrowed from the past. But he loved too many too quickly. And Helena couldn't bear what she found out. She paused, breath catching. There was an argument. Helena told him not to go to sea. He said he had no choice. She told him to wait by the chapel bell at midnight. He did. She didn't come. He never came back. The room fell still. She blamed herself, you see, all these years, not for what she said, but for what she couldn't forgive. Miss Marple knew then that the truth had never been hidden in records or archives. It had been buried in guilt, sealed in sorrow, and guarded not out of shame, but out of love's ruin. Calder's death was no mere accident. It had been the consequence of a heart betrayed, a promise broken, and a silence held so long it had become legend. And Thornhaven, for all its grandeur, had never truly escaped the night its future was lost to the waves. In stirring the past, Miss Marple had not uncovered a crime, but something far more dangerous, a grief unresolved, and a truth that had poisoned every quiet moment since. Beneath the creeping hush of ivy-choked stone walls, and among the moss-laced paths of Briarwood Hollow, a village untouched by time, yet saturated with the weight of untold stories, Miss Eloan Hartley walked with the quiet conviction of someone who understood that truth, when buried, does not rot, it roots itself deeper, like a stubborn weed in sacred ground. Here among aging spinsters, with sharp eyes and tea-stained teacups, where even the birdsong seemed to pause at the mention of certain names, silence had been weaponized for generations. The story truly began with a photograph, one found not in a place of honor, but slipped between the frail yellowed pages of a prayer book long forgotten in the attic of Ashgrove House. Clara Wren, the late vicar's daughter, trembling with uncertainty, and the faint pulse of unearthed inheritance, had handed it to Eloan without words, as if fearing that language itself might awaken what history had labored to bury. 3 figures stared back from the image. Isadora Vale, poised and glacial, infamous in her day for a grace so perfect it bordered on menace. Commander Alaric Blackwood, whose death in 1943 had been tucked neatly under the phrase tragic accident, and a woman unknown, her features bearing such an uncanny resemblance to Clara's own mother, that Eloan felt a chill, not from the photo's age, but from the echo of secrets it carried. There were no names inscribed, no dates, only the uncomfortable closeness of 3 lives that once intersected like blades. That very night, with the kind of stillness only deep secrets summon, a folded piece of parchment appeared beneath Eloan's door, its paper soft from years of concealment, its ink smeared but unmistakable. Ask what truly happened in the greenhouse the night before the storm. No name, no sender, just that single line, heavy as a curse. The greenhouse, it stood now as nothing more than a tangle of rusted frame and shattered glass, half swallowed by thorn and vine, but back then it had been the heart of the Vale estate. A place of orchids and whispered rendezvous, of things grown and things hidden. No one spoke of it anymore. They had, it seemed, agreed not to. Eloan began to ask quietly, gently, knowing that the past here responded not to force but to patience. And it was Mr. Dalloway, old, stooped and nearly blind, who finally gave her more than silence. He had been the Vale family's gardener in those years, a man whose hands still remembered the feel of wet earth better than his tongue remembered words. Yet that night he remembered too well. Isadora, in crimson not morning black, had stood outside the greenhouse near dusk, still and sharp against the wind, as if waiting for something she didn't truly expect to come. And someone else had come, a smaller figure, nimble and determined, moving like a shadow across the orchard path, and vanishing inside just before the rain began. By morning, Commander Blackwood was dead, found face down near the river with an injury that no fall could explain. The coroner had scribbled accidental drowning, and the town had sighed in relief. No scandal, no trial, no further questions. Dalloway, with the memory of someone who had tended both roses and rumors, remembered the crushed lilies near the greenhouse, fresh blood among their petals, and a trail of footprints leading away from the river, not toward it. Eloan, in the days that followed, combed through the village archives, sifting through brittle reports and unsent letters, until she found one that had never seen daylight. It was addressed to no one, dated the night of the storm, and written in Isadora's own hand. I did not strike him, but I let him go, knowing he wouldn't return. There it was, guilt, not in the act, but in the omission, and in that single sentence bloomed a dozen terrible possibilities. Clara's mother, once a maid under a different name, had left the Vale household abruptly following that night. Unwed, pregnant, and carrying a truth too dangerous to share, she had married into obscurity, erasing a past that had never stopped watching her. Clara, unknowingly born of a web that had cost a man his life and a woman her peace, now held the photograph like a relic from a war she hadn't known her family had fought. The greenhouse, once a sanctuary for orchids, had become a monument to unfinished stories. It had seen something that night, a confrontation perhaps, or a confession. Maybe Blackwood had discovered something about Isadora's wartime dealings, or perhaps he had threatened to reveal a truth that would destroy more than just a name. And someone scared enough, hurt enough, loyal enough, had ensured he never would. Elowen stood among the broken glass and remembered what she had once read, that light reveals, but shadow remembers. And here, among the ruins of a garden that had once bloomed with forbidden things, the past had begun to whisper again. Not with screams or gunshots, but in the soft rustle of ivy, in the way the photograph's edges curled like burned paper, and in the silence of women who had carried their truths like thorns beneath silk. The village, she knew now, hadn't forgotten. It had merely agreed to pretend. And sometimes, the only way to unearth the truth is to speak where others have chosen not to listen. Beneath the tangled shadows of the orchard, where the air always seemed to murmur secrets rather than breeze, stood a sundial, old, unyielding, and curiously immune to the passage of time. It did not mark hours anymore. Instead it measured memory, silence and regret. On the evening before Captain Armand Leclerc's death, he had asked someone to meet him there. Not out of romance, not for leisure, but with urgency, as if time itself had begun to close in on him. The invitation had been sent discreetly, perhaps out of desperation, or perhaps out of guilt long festering. Witnesses, though few and unreliable, had seen Eleanor Vane, walking alone in the orchard's fading light, her steps slow, uncertain. She had told no one, she had spoken of nothing afterward. For years her silence was dressed in the clothes of mourning, the silence of someone who had lost a great love. But to Miss Dahlia Stroud, a woman of quiet perception, and a piercing sense of human frailty, that silence reeked not of sorrow, but of concealment. Captain Leclerc never returned to his quarters. 2 days later, his body was found wedged beneath a stone weir at the far end of the estate's brook. He bore a deep contusion across his ribs, a mark that could not be explained by any fall or current. The official report was sterile and conclusive, an accident, perhaps a misstep in the dark. But Miss Stroud knew better. The bruise did not align with chance, it aligned with intent. Something had happened beneath the shroud of dusk, a meeting that had turned into a confrontation, a reckoning that had ended with one life drowned, and another imprisoned in years of self-inflicted silence. Eleanor, once the heart of the estate's music and laughter, had slowly withdrawn from society, her once vibrant presence reduced to distant glances and absent stares. But the orchard remembered, the sundial remembered. And now, Miss Stroud was beginning to remember too, not her own past, but that of others, which had stubbornly refused to remain buried. Oswin Faulkner, a man whose easy charm barely concealed his calculating ambitions, had stumbled upon something he was never meant to find. Perhaps a letter tucked between the pages of an old household ledger, perhaps a photograph that should never have existed. Or maybe a journal, the kind kept by women who cannot say aloud what they fear even to think. Whatever it was, it connected Captain Leclerc, Eleanor, and an inheritance too fragile to bear the truth. Oswin, opportunistic and arrogant, had not confronted the past, he had tried to bargain with it. The signs were all there, the mysterious pawnshop visits, the sudden vanishing of heirloom jewelry, the cryptic, half-mocking remarks about lineage and legitimacy, whispered over drinks and echoed in drawing rooms. He had been attempting to twist the truth into something profitable. But what he didn't realize was that the past, once poked, can bite. He had not merely threatened exposure, he had threatened to tear down the entire illusion someone had spent decades building and defending. Someone, Miss Stroud suspected, who had grown tired of living in the dark. Someone who was finally willing to kill to keep their world from collapsing. It was in the old music room, beneath a time-worn piano bench ignored for years, that Miss Stroud discovered it. An unassuming leather-bound journal, hidden beneath layers of forgotten Beethoven sonatas. The clasp was antique, the binding delicate, and the paper inside was the color of time. The handwriting, unmistakably Eleanor's, was graceful yet strained, like a voice trying not to tremble. The entries began shortly after Captain Leclerc's death and stretched across the early years of Eleanor's retreat from public life. They did not speak of romance, they whispered of missteps, regrets, missed moments, and a child mentioned only obliquely, someone never publicly acknowledged, yet clearly held in secret affection. One passage halted Miss Stroud's breath entirely. I could never say it. Not then, not now. But she deserved more than silence. Perhaps that is why I cannot let go. The sundial remembers what I cannot speak. It was a confession not of murder but of mourning. Mourning for the things never said, the truths never protected. Yet it wasn't what the journal contained that unsettled Miss Stroud the most. It was what had been deliberately removed. The final page had been torn out, not cut neatly, not fallen by chance, but violently, intentionally ripped from its spine, leaving behind a jagged wound of threads. The last words, still visible on the preceding leaf, ended mid-thought. He said he would wait by the sundial. I told him, and then nothing, just a silence so loud it roared in Miss Stroud's ears. She stared at the missing page as one might stare into an open grave. That missing fragment held the fulcrum of it all. Love, loss, betrayal, and blood. Someone had erased the final truth. But truths, Miss Stroud knew, have a peculiar way of surviving. They linger in whispers, in wounds, in places like sundials that no longer tell time but refuse to forget. She stared at the empty space where something once was, a page that should have been there, a truth aching to be told, now gone, ripped or stolen. She couldn't be sure who had taken it, and why. Had Eleanor, in her final fragile moment, torn it away herself in some desperate attempt at protection, or had a more fearful hand removed it to bury something damning, something dangerous? Whatever had been inscribed on that missing page had weight, perhaps enough to safeguard a name, perhaps enough to condemn a soul. As Miss Langford closed the fragile book with a whisper-soft motion, the silence that followed was not peace, but prelude. A single page lost, yet its absence screamed like a wound still bleeding in the dark. And then, like a storm gathering in a still sky, the drawing room at Ashthorne Manor fell into a silence not of weather, but of waiting souls. It was a silence swollen with secrets, patient as breath before a scream. Without raising her voice, Miss Langford had summoned the household. No demands, only a request for an hour, and not a single person had dared say no. Grace sat stiffly near the fireplace, her composure cracked by fear and memory. Mr. Ellison lingered by the curtains, his hands behind him, his eyes unreadable but narrowed by concern or guilt, or both. Clara looked lost, folded into herself like a closed book, while Miss Bellamy remained at the door, her posture rigid, her gaze lowered as if avoiding ghosts. No one poured tea, no one even moved. Then gently but with unshakable clarity, Miss Langford began. There are truths that wait for the right season to bloom, and I believe Ashthorne has waited too long for its spring. No one spoke, but the air thickened as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. 2 deaths, she said softly, one grieved, one barely understood, both haunted by shadows that never left. She placed an old letter on the table, a delicate flower pressed between its folds, faded but intact. This was sent to Mrs. Bell before she died. Not a cry for help, but a quiet reckoning. She knew what was coming. She accepted it. Grace's hand twitched. Miss Langford's voice carried like wind through still leaves. This wasn't about sentimentality or madness. It was her final act of truth, a rewriting of the past that had been buried too long. She left part of her estate to Clara not out of guilt, but because Clara was not just a maid. She was family. The room stirred, a sharp inhale from Grace, a sudden movement from Mr. Ellison, but the detective didn't stop. I found a journal, hidden, not forgotten. It speaks of a love denied, a child born in secrecy, and a promise kept in silence. Clara is not Mrs. Bell's daughter, but her niece, born of a forbidden romance between Eleanor's younger sister and a man named Alden Reeve, who disappeared under suspicious circumstances decades ago. Clara froze. She grew up unaware, raised by strangers, while Eleanor watched from afar, sending help in quiet ways, never daring to step forward. Until now. The will was her confession, her closure. The letter trembled slightly as the breeze from the open window touched it. Someone didn't want that truth known. Someone feared it would unravel everything. And so someone killed to keep it buried. Twice, her eyes swept the room slowly. And that someone is in this room. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but anticipation, sharp, charged, and deadly, as if the very house was holding its breath before it shattered. Sometimes, what we inherit is not wealth or land, but secrets too heavy to carry. That evening, as storm clouds crept over the decaying arches of the Whitmore estate, and the wind whispered like voices through the ivy-covered stone, a silence settled so thick it seemed to choke the very air. Beneath the dust of a forgotten study, Madeline Whitmore, believed by all to be the late Sir Richard's legitimate granddaughter, unlocked a cabinet thought to have been sealed since the war. Inside, hidden beneath yellowing maps and medals, lay an old leather-bound diary, pages brittle, ink faded, but the truths within searing like fire. It was there, scribbled between dates and dispatches from 1943, that she found the shattered reflection of her identity. Her name linked not to Richard's blood, but to his younger sister Evelyn, a woman shamed by wartime love, betrayed by time, and buried in silence. And when Madeline read the torn page, marked only with a haunting fragment, Captain 8, the child must never, her heart clenched with a truth that refused to be buried again. Inspector Harold Crane, summoned originally to investigate Sir Richard's suspicious fall from the upper landing, now stood at the edge of a revelation that threatened to unravel not just a family but an entire legacy. This wasn't about a fall, it was about a fracture. As pieces fell into place, Harold realized the motive wasn't greed alone. It was fear, deep, ancestral fear, that the truth would strip away the illusion of nobility, and expose the carefully constructed lies upon which the Whitmore name had stood for decades. Someone had known, someone had preserved this secret like a loaded gun, and when Madeline, perhaps by chance, perhaps lured, stumbled upon it, that gun had fired. Caroline, Richard's aging widow, once a woman of impeccable restraint, met Harold's questions with a chilling stillness. "Do you know what a name costs, Inspector?" she whispered at last, her voice not trembling, but hollow. "Sometimes everything." There were no dramatic confessions, no breaking sobs, only the terrifying grace of a truth so long suppressed it had turned to stone. Sir Richard had died not out of rage or accident, but because he had tried to renegotiate history, to silence a final act of conscience by forcing Evelyn to disown the child she once bore in shame but never stopped loving. When Evelyn refused, he turned to Caroline with threats not of scandal, but of exposure. In a house already shadowed by war rumors and hidden affairs, Caroline chose the unthinkable, not for money, not for hatred, but for silence. Because silence, to the Whitmores, had always been safer than truth, and as Madeline stood there, clutching the diary like a relic of the dead, her voice broke the quiet with only 6 fragile words. "She gave me more than money," and in that moment, everything changed. Not because a murder was solved, but because a girl, denied a history, had reclaimed it. The morning light slipped like a quiet apology through the fractured panes of the conservatory, its golden fingers catching on motes of dust that danced lazily in the air, undisturbed by breath or movement, as though the house itself had been holding still for years, waiting for this moment. Eleanor Blake's last letter, creased, weather-stained, and trembling in the hands that held it, was not addressed to anyone, yet spoke to everyone, its unspoken agony bleeding between the lines. The words were fragmented, almost reluctant, like truths that had spent too long buried beneath silk and stone. It had begun long before her death, before the whispers of poison, and the bitter scent of orange blossoms that clung to her room like a memory too sharp to fade. Inspector Raines had known upon entering Ashcroft, that grief was not what haunted this place. It was guilt, thick and ancestral, layered like old wallpaper, curling at the edges where time had refused to forget. The family gathered like statues, eyes averted, lips pressed into lines too familiar to be mistaken for innocence. Claire, Eleanor's niece, was the only one who broke, the only one whose grief wasn't rehearsed. It was she who found the photograph behind the nursery mirror, a young woman, her mother frightened and small, standing beside a man whose face had been scratched out with deliberate cruelty. And it was Claire who discovered the iron key inside the chipped teacup, tucked away behind a row of untouched silverware, a key that slid into the lock of the forgotten greenhouse door like it had been waiting. What lay behind it wasn't ruin, but something far more terrifying: preservation. A table set for two, cups now dry and cracked with age, chairs positioned like someone had only just stood and walked away, and at the center, a dried sprig of wormwood, tied in faded black ribbon, resting atop a leather-bound journal stiff with mold and confession. The entries were desperate, sprawling in tone, from fear to fury, from love to betrayal. Eleanor's words painted the portrait of a man who wielded silence as a weapon, who threatened not only the inheritance but the very bloodlines beneath it. Claire's mother hadn't died abroad as they claimed. She'd been hidden, imprisoned in her own home, drugged and erased, her child raised in ignorance for the sake of legacy. When Eleanor wrote, "I took the root before he could," it became clear, the poison had been her act of rebellion, her twisted form of mercy, her final attempt to protect what little light was left in the house's shadows. Beneath the greenhouse floor, under a flagstone, lifted with trembling hands, Claire found a shallow grave lined with magnolia petals, unnaturally preserved and sweet with the scent of endings. Not justice, not peace, but remembrance. Inspector Raines watched as Claire knelt by the wall, her fingers tracing the worn stone, the air around her vibrating with the ache of generations denied their voice. "She didn't leave me," she whispered, the tears not falling from grief, but recognition. They buried her silence. No one spoke. The house, once a monument to wealth and decorum, now seemed to breathe, its walls exhaling a secret long held, its halls resonating not with judgment but reluctant relief. The sundial in the orchard cast its shadow cleanly now free of moss, its Latin inscription, Tempus omnia revelet, time reveals all, finally fulfilled. The wormwood trembled in the breeze as if mourning with them, and the magnolia tree by the garden wall, under which so many lies had bloomed, stood in solemn bloom, its blossoms pale and ghost-like, pages in a story too long untold, now at last, allowed to be heard. There are houses where the silence doesn't merely linger, it settles, like dust that can't be brushed away, embedding itself in woodgrain and stone until even the light seems hesitant to enter. Ravenscroft Hollow was one such place, a grand but weather-worn estate tucked away at the edge of Dunsmuir village, where ivy choked the eastern wing, and no birds dared nest in the eaves. It had once been a home of music and laughter, but over the years, loss had crept into its halls like a draught through an ill-sealed door, slowly draining color from curtains, voices from rooms, and warmth from the very walls. Grief here had matured into something older than sorrow, ritualized silence, performed over generations, each new tragedy folded into the last without ever being spoken aloud. But everything shifted after the final letter was found, not buried in drawers or hidden behind portraits, but sewn deliberately into the lining of a faded cloak, left in the west attic, a cloak once worn by Beatrice Everell, the first mistress of Ravenscroft, whose sudden disappearance had haunted the family for nearly a century. It was Margot, the last living descendant, who found it, following the sound of dripping water and a flicker of candlelight no one else claimed to have seen. She hadn't come for answers, only to oversee the estate's sale, but the moment her fingers brushed the parchment, still scented faintly with lavender and iron, something ancient stirred. The letter was not a farewell, but a confession, scrawled with urgency and heartbreak, revealing a legacy of betrayal, an inheritance soaked not in wealth but in silence, where daughters were hidden, sisters erased, and truth exiled for the comfort of decorum. That same evening, the grandfather clock, still and mute for over 30 years, chimed once unprovoked. Doors began to open with surprising ease, as if the house itself had begun to breathe again, hesitant but eager. Hallways once choked with shadows, now held the faintest echo of voices, and rooms long locked seemed to whisper to Margot, when she passed, urging her deeper into memory's web. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Alden, who had refused to set foot beyond the servants' stairs for decades, was seen quietly dusting the stained glass landing without being asked, her hands trembling not from age, but recognition. When Margot uncovered the false floorboard beneath the nursery, beneath where no child had slept in 50 years, she found more than dust, a rusted locket, a child's drawing with a red X over a faceless figure, and a small twisted ring that didn't fit any known finger in the family. The past had not just been forgotten, it had been sealed, hidden with intention, like a wound stitched too tightly. The truth, when finally spoken aloud beneath the oil portrait of Beatrice, didn't erase the pain, nor absolve the sins that followed it, but it did shift something in the bones of the house, in the lineage itself. Margot, once determined to leave, now moved through the hollow, not as an intruder, but as someone bearing witness. She opened the ballroom shutters, let the wind rattle the chandeliers, let memory scream if it had to. She didn't seek vengeance, only clarity, and in doing so she unearthed stories once entombed behind silence, of women written out of wills, of children named but never held, of love punished because it did not look proper enough in daylight. Ravencroft would not forget, its walls too saturated with truth for that, but it would no longer demand silence. When the village solicitor arrived with papers to finalize the estate's dissolution, Margot declined. Instead she announced the hollow would become an archive, not of ledgers and lineage but of lost voices, a place where forgotten lives could be named again. The East Wing, once collapsed under rot and grief, would be rebuilt as a center for history's unrecorded, truths unwelcome in polite society. And so the hollow began to transform, not with noise or grandeur, but with small steady things. Laughter from young girls reading aloud in sunlit corners, the aroma of cinnamon and ink, and most of all breath, deep, honest breath, in a house that had held it far too long. Miss Annerly, the village historian, watched it all unfold from her garden across the lane, and said only this: when the dead are heard, the living finally rise. Inheritance, Margot realized, was not about what was left behind, it was about what you dared to uncover, and what you chose to carry forward. As dusk settled over Ravenhill Grange, it felt as though the old walls were whispering, not with words but with the kind of silence that slices deeper than sound. This wasn't a tomb, and yet the house breathed like an old diary, each page a secret, every secret a scar. For days people believed Lady Althea's death was a tragic accident. But everything changed when Nora Blackwood arrived, a quiet, composed librarian, whose calm presence held storms of its own. She didn't interrogate anyone. She simply observed a brooch that once adorned Lady Althea's collar, now locked away in a forgotten drawer, beside an antique clock frozen in time, much like the truth that had long been buried. Then one stormy night, as the rain struck the stairs like sorrow falling in rhythmic echoes, Nora opened a faded music box. From within, a lullaby whispered of childhood long past, and tucked beneath it, a torn letter that read, "Forgive me, for I had no choice." That was the moment everything changed. Lady Althea hadn't just died, she had carried a love that was never returned, and a loyalty so heavy it had split her heart in two. Nora didn't call the police or point fingers. She stitched the mystery together like threads lost in an old embroidery, an untouched diary corner, a cropped face in a photograph, a faint footprint still damp in the garden soil. Even the old gardener, Miss Fenn, who rarely spoke, once recalled Lady Althea telling him, "Some truths wait for death before they dare to be spoken." That's when Nora recognized the shape of the truth. It wasn't just behind the death, it was beneath the faces of those who'd lived with carefully preserved images of themselves. Charles, who laid a flower on her grave every week. Helena, who wept behind latticed windows, hiding a portrait that seemed to burn slowly from within. When Nora finally penned the truth, she ended not with a verdict, but with a question: is truth always worth telling, if it breaks the only thing someone has left to live for? Ravenhill Grange now waits again, for another season, for another truth to rise. A truth that does not rage but returns on its own time, like spring thawing through frost. And if you had stood where Nora did, would you have gently pieced together the silence, or buried it deeper, where it would never rise again? Tell us in the comments, because every perspective reveals a new edge, and every voice sharpens the shape of a mystery. If you found this story compelling, do subscribe and share it with anyone who can stomach a sharp truth with a warm cup of tea. Until next time, Remember, some secrets breathe beneath the soil, just waiting for someone like Nora to bring them back to life.